Hi folks, this is Charlie Wilbridge here on Gadigal land from the LGBTI Health Alliance. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands in which we're all meeting on and across the country, acknowledge them as our traditional owners and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander folk that get to view this video. I'm here today to talk about the LGBTI Suicide Prevention Literature Review with Ros Bellamy from La Trobe University. Hello, Ros.
Hi, Charlie.
Thanks for coming. So we brought you on to do a LGBTI Suicide Prevention Literature Review. How hard was it to actually find quality papers out there?
So I found there are plenty of quality papers out there. There's just not enough Australian papers looking at interventions and initiatives specifically. So there was a lot about the context for mental health and suicide prevention and looking at the negative outcomes particularly, but not enough necessarily on what is being trialled and what has been found to work.
Right. I guess that highlights the importance then going forward of the Black Dog lifespan trial and other research that's coming out evaluating the trials currently.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I kind of flagged going through the papers as well was the need for exploratory studies. So different kind of pilot feasibility studies and evaluations of things like that Black Dog lifespan trial as well.
Yeah, awesome, Ros. So what do you think some of the key learnings were?
I mean, there's so much that came out of it. There are around 100 papers cited. So one major theme, I suppose, that came through is the need for social and community support and how vital that is for well-being and particularly peer support within the community as well. That came through really strongly. And I looked at the literature in terms of the different approaches, but also the different lifespans as well. And that just came through across all the different interventions and initiatives being trialled. Another thing was the need for affirming healthcare and clinical approaches. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's also something that we need to address, and particularly during a pandemic and where more and more people are possibly seeking different referrals to different clinical support, that sort of thing. Just the need for it, the need in terms of the different approaches and things like affirming cognitive behavioral therapy or various psychological support services that are inclusive of the LGBTI communities.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a key thing, that we really need to ensure that our healthcare workers on all levels are competent when working with LGBTI people and communities. And it's good that you mentioned the peer support work, as I've seen it increased in talk around that in the mental health sector, and the value of peer support and in lived experience as well when working with communities. Do you think anything came up that surprised you?
One thing I was really glad to see was how much interest sharing interventions came up. I looked at some of the different creative approaches being trialed, but also things around sport and physical and social and emotional interests, so to speak, and just looking at the way that that could be either promoting well-being or some of them talked about increasing people's agency around mastering their own well-being. One thing that surprised me, even though I suppose it shouldn't have, was how little research there was around LGBTI older adult populations. And again, to mention COVID, but seeing the current crisis around aged care, and that kind of indicates an opportunity to me there as well, where it looks like, you know, either during or after this time, we're going to have to, as a society, really do a lot of soul searching around how aged care works, and noting how little there was that was being trialed. It were more focused on loneliness and, you know, what people are experiencing, and, you know, after possibly lifetime of marginalization or different pathologization of identities and all those sorts of things, that there isn't sort of enough being trialed apart from talking about increasing community connection and ensuring either peer support or that people have someone to turn to.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Roz, and it just shows that suicide doesn't discriminate, and we need to be looking at all of our communities, from young people up to older people as well. Do you see some gaps or opportunities to increase the evidence base?
Yeah, absolutely. So I noticed one thing was that quite a few of the papers talked about the need for structural level change to make change for LGBTI people, which feels like such a huge thing to, I mean, obviously it's important to acknowledge that, but I feel like in some ways that can be a limitation in itself when we look around just the enormity of how much needs to change to improve life for LGBTI folks. So I think in terms of the gaps and opportunities there, I think it's important to kind of look on that micro and macro level of individual communities and within people's, you know, interpersonal relationships, and also on that broader social level. So in terms of gaps there, I found like some initiatives that looked really exciting or really promising, but they just hadn't been evaluated. So I think there's more need, more research into different initiatives being trialed, including longitudinal studies and just really robust evaluations of interventions. Also more around particular communities, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, LGBTIQ+ people, sister girl and brother boy communities, and other marginalised communities as well, just the need for culturally responsive support services and resources, and particularly interventions that really do focus on intersections between different communities, because a lot of it tends to be segregated, unfortunately, and very much siloed.
Yeah, and that's a shame. I feel like we need to be across all of our communities and those intersections, whether it's refugees, culturally and linguistically diverse as well, plus you mentioned Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. On a structural level, I guess that's where the importance of Christine Morgan work is coming in, and it'll be really exciting to see how that unfolds and how the LGBTI inclusion is in that as well.
Absolutely.
Given today's World Suicide Prevention Day, I thought, reflecting on the review that you've done so far, would you have maybe 3 ideas or considerations that we can learn from that would shine a light on LGBTI suicide prevention?
Yeah, so it's hard to narrow it down to 3. There's a lot. So one thing that came through was the need for addressing barriers to participation for people on all different levels. And one that came up quite a bit, I suppose another area I was a bit surprised by, but glad to see research being done in the area of, was in terms of religious and faith-based and cultural communities, and the need for addressing these communities through interventions that are really, I suppose, culturally informed around language as well, and communication, and just how easy it is to alienate and make things inaccessible, you know, even with best intentions. So definitely the need for addressing barriers. Another one, and I mentioned this before, was just the need to, for more evaluation. But one thing that came up that really interested me was around, even once people have been sort of gotten into interventions that are working for them, whether it's clinical or community-based, peer-based, the need for continuing to evaluate it. So not just going, great, you know, this many people are involved in this, but checking that it's continuing to work for them. And this was mentioned around young people particularly, so not just getting them into some sort of intervention, but also checking that it's actually working for them. And within those, sort of building stress coping strategies and dealing with the occurrence of suicidal thoughts or attempts as well, making sure people are really equipped to deal with those as they come up. And then the third one that I thought of as well was I loved the word that came up in one paper, which was de-isolation. And it came up in relation to older adult populations, but I think it's so relevant to just everyone. And the idea of ensuring that people, no matter what their age, no matter what their life experience is, that they have social community connections and peer support where needed. And one thing that came up strongly in that was volunteering. And I've been hearing more and more lately in LGBTI communities about volunteering and just what people have noticed around how it can bring people in a way that perhaps they wouldn't feel comfortable joining something particularly around mental health specifically, but when they're involved for the greater good, so to speak, that can sort of bring them in and engage them and then give them some sort of connection. So I think, yeah, those would be my three main takeaways.
I agree with you. Very hard to narrow it down to 3 takeaways, but thank you so much for those insights and having a little interview today. We're really looking forward to the release of this literature review and getting it out and adding to the evidence base of LGBTI suicide prevention. So thank you so much, Roz.
Thank you so much.
And I'm here with Lisa Ryan, who's our consultant, and we're both coming from Wongal and Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. So Lisa, as you know, we released the National LGBTI Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Strategy in 2017. A lot has changed in the sector within communities and sector, and so it's exciting that you've been spending some time updating that for us. So I'm wondering what kind of process you've had so far.
Well, it's been a nice kind of well-rounded process, Charlie, in as much as the first thing that I did was I looked back at that original strategy and looked at what elements of it had progressed since then and where there were elements that still felt really relevant, like there was work to build on. So really learning from the process that you went through last time and also the feedback that you received from stakeholders. I think people were incredibly generous in providing you with feedback about how to support implementation of that strategy. So really kind of digging into all of that. And then from there, I've done kind of a mixture of looking at what the policy and literature tells us. So I've been looking at policy and literature that is specific to our communities, specific to communities within our communities, and also looking at the mainstream mental health framework. So things like the National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Strategy. So that's all the kind of desk-based stuff. And then I've also been talking to people to hear their insights into what the issues are for our communities and what the priorities need to be for the next few years. And so I've done a series of focus groups with community members, including trans and gender diverse community leaders, intersex community leaders, and then talking with some of our community organisations, everyone through from small grassroots community organisations through to some of our bigger, long-standing community organisations. And then from there, and we're about to launch a survey, which I absolutely want to get on people's radars. And then the next step from there will be I'll kind of mix all of that together to identify the things that we think are going to make the biggest difference to mental health, social and emotional wellbeing and suicide prevention for our communities.
It's a big job, Lisa, and thank you for taking that on, and the broadness of your consultations is really great, and we look forward to hearing what the community have to say with that survey as well. Are there any kind of trends that you've been seeing as you've been doing the consultations?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that really stands out to me is just the absolute strength and resilience in our communities. I think we always need to hold together the areas where things could be better for us and the absolute strength. And that's, the strength is both on an individual level, but also on a community level in terms of the sheer generosity and skillfulness that individuals bring to supporting other members in the community. That's a really big theme that's there across all of the consultations. I think, but unfortunately, there's also really strong indicators that our communities are struggling, and that's backed up by some data, it's backed up by some research, but it's also backed up by the stories that we hear from individual community members, from community leaders, from community organisations. So kind of the first theme is we're strong and we're struggling. There's also a really strong theme about there's a lot that we across LGBT and I have in common in terms of minority stress, in terms of we live in a world that is not always welcoming and appreciative of our sexuality and gender differences. So really kind of locating the challenges around mental health and suicide prevention in the society that we're a part of, rather than it being about individual kind of pathology. So there's a real commonality across LGBT&I, but also there's really distinct experiences within that. And we need to kind of hold together things that we need to be in solidarity around, as well as being really honest about the differences between us. And that's differences in lived experience, but also differences in what people need. So obviously for trans and gender diverse people, gender affirming care is a really critical part of mental health and suicide prevention. For people with sex variations, being free from non-consensual interventions is a really important part of their wellbeing. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, LGBTI and sister girls and brother boys, having access to culturally appropriate ways of supporting social and emotional wellbeing. So it's kind of the commonalities, but also the differences are really important.
Yeah, there are some key differences, and it's some of the things you've mentioned there is good, because we heard from Roz earlier around the literature review, and it's backed up by what people are saying during consultations with some of the literature that's happening. So it's good to see that we're on the same, well, the right path, I guess. Did anything come up though that surprised you?
Look, I think one of the things that I'm really sitting with is that some of these things we've been saying for a really long time. And I guess it's not so much it surprises me as, you know, it's just, I struggle with the idea that our communities have been saying this and that some of the research and data have been telling us this for a while. So that's one of the things that I'm just really sitting with. It was kind of encouraging to see in the federal government's National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan that there are a number of references to our community, an acknowledgement that the data shows that our community is doing it disproportionately tough. And so thinking about the federal government's commitment to zero suicide, well, that includes zero suicide amongst us as well. And so we have to think about ways that we can get that translated into meaningful action kind of across Australia. I think one of the other things that I'm really sitting with, again, it's not really a surprise, but I am really just kind of, it has really struck me through the process, is how much of this work and really important work is being done by peers, whether that's just friends looking after friends or networks of people. So, you know, networks like the Intersex Peer Support Network, really critical, literally life-saving, life-changing work. Other really small community organisations, really grassroots stuff, and that is so impressive. But it's also, people are doing, that work takes a toll on people, and we're just not supporting that enough. And I think the other thing that, again, it hasn't really surprised me, but it has really challenged me to think really deeply about it, is how we kind of hold together solidarity across the LGBTI communities. There are things that hold us together, but also really allowing for the differences, and thinking about the times when I personally haven't perhaps been as knowledgeable or as good an ally as I could have been. And so just sitting with how to kind of pick up my role in that a bit better and make sure that's really deeply embedded across all of the strategy.
Yeah, those really good insights, Lisa. I think data is a big one that we talk about all the time. So we'll be looking forward to seeing what happens with the census that's coming up, but it's vital that we're captured in this data so appropriate resources can be skewed towards us, especially those grassroots organisations that you're talking about with no funding. There's a few in the LGBTI, Aboriginal, brother, boy, sister, girl space, and without funding and support for them, it's burnout and it's not sustainable. So it's really nice to hear that that's coming through as a need as well.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I should say something about the data. I think it's been really striking that in every single focus group, whether it's people who are more experienced working in research or policy, whether it's community organisations, whether it's real kind of grassroots leaders, every single conversation has a really strong focus on data. So we are all secretly data nerds going, we just need better evidence to kind of argue our case.
Absolutely. I feel like we're using that in almost all of our sentences within the sector and community. So it's good to hear. So I guess reflecting on the process so far, what would you say the three key maybe ideas or considerations we could learn from that shine a light on the future of LGBTI suicide prevention or current?
Look, I think one of the things that that I'm sitting with is we really need to get to primary prevention. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that that contributes to those poorer mental health and social and emotional well-being outcomes, and they go to things like education. You know, I mean, it's not really surprising, but it is shocking to me that we're having the same kinds of conversations about disrupted education for 15-year-old trans and gender diverse kids, and thinking about what that's going to mean for their future employment options, what that's going to mean for future risk of poverty, that 40 years ago we were talking about gay men. That's just not okay. So we need to get to some of those fundamental drivers of disadvantage and of social exclusion. For trans and gender diverse people, that includes gender affirming care that's supported by policy and legislation, so that that's really embedded in kind of every point of interaction with the system. For people with variations in sex characteristics, again, that's about consensual care, peer support, kind of pathways into really good peer connectedness. I think the second area I identify is really around peer support and community connectedness generally. I think we learnt that lesson from the earliest days of HIV, in fact, that community connectedness is a protective factor, and I think the research that we do have for our communities suggests that that's true generally across LGBTI. And then we want every organisation that someone in our community approaches in relation to mental health and suicide prevention to be a safe, welcoming and inclusive place, whether that's mainstream mental health organisations actually having the skills and the practices that are welcoming and inclusive of our communities, whether that's LGBTI organisations having the capability, so having enough resources to do really skillful mental health work with our community. And we know there's some excellent work happening across the country in relation to that. But also we know that our communities don't only want to access mainstream mental health organisations and LGBTI organisations. We know that for Aboriginal people, Aboriginal community controlled health services are a critical place to access culturally safe care. So we want those places to be welcoming of sexual and gender diversity as well. So yeah, so I think primary prevention, peer connectedness, and every place safe and skillful in providing mental health care for our communities.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned the Aboriginal community controlled organisations. Such a big thing for our First Nations to be able to access culturally safe help and healthcare and still be able to feel safe when it comes to gender, sexuality. And so that's really important as well. And I guess it kind of highlights when you bring in education that this isn't just a mental health issue. This is across the board. Like suicide and mental health is not just about the mental health cycle. We're talking about employment, we're talking about education, sports, government, we're talking about a whole lot. So it's really nice to hear that that's what's coming through in the consultations.
Absolutely. So I think we think about that whole kind of continuum. We want everyone to be well and healthy. We want to reduce any barriers that might come up that are social. And then at an individual level where someone's struggling, we want them to get the earliest, best access to whatever support they need. And we want that all to be kind of wrapped around peer support and community connectedness, because that's part of protecting people's wellbeing.
Yeah, totally agree there as well. The peer workforce, but peer-based support is so important. Thank you so much for giving us a rundown of that, Lisa. It's really nice to hear what's going on, and we look forward to the survey coming out and also the end strategy. For those folk who are interested, you can subscribe for regular updates for our mental health and suicide prevention resource on the link that is pictured below. And thanks again, Lisa, for your time, and I look forward to our continued work together.
Great. I think this gives us a great opportunity to say, together as a community, there's a bunch of stuff that we need from government and services. And yeah, I think it's a great contribution.
Thanks so much.